You're recording. Okay, fantastic. So, good evening, everybody. My name is Ken Rosenthal, and I'm a park naturalist at Gulf Branch Nature Center. I almost said here at Gulf Branch Nature Center, but that wouldn't be correct for anybody but me. We are going to talk tonight about bird colors, so I'm not going to waste your time. I'm going to get started in that. If you have trouble seeing anything, let me know. But I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. We're going to go right to the PowerPoint and get that started. We're going to talk about bird colors. I like birds. I'm going to confess that right away. So it was really easy to pick a subject for this month. I wanted to talk about how important bird colors are, and I'd read a couple things I thought it'd be really neat, and it's turned into, just like everything else, there's about 1,000 rabbit holes you could go down, and there's probably a few other programs I'm hoping to pick up out of this. But again, I want to thank you for being here. We're going to talk about bird colors. If you've done one of these with me before, you know I like to kind of set our place in the natural world, and I'm going to do that a couple of ways here to get started. I am going to define color. Yeah, we are going to go real basic here, but I want to make sure that we all agree in physics it's the quality of the wavelength of light emitted or reflected from an object, and that is essentially what our eyes are going to pick up. So when you are looking at something and it is blue or green or purple, those are the wavelengths that are being reflected back at your eyes. Those are not the colors that are being absorbed. The color that's being absorbed is not what you're seeing because it's not transmitted back to your eyes. And of course, this definition includes the word emitted. I don't believe we have any birds that will be doing any emitting today. They will all be reflecting. So we're going to stick with that reflected part of that definition for our talk tonight. And how the eye sees in color. Actually, I want to skip past that. I've got. I want to talk more about the different kinds of visual sensors. There's rods and cones. Rods are better at picking up light, but they are not. They don't really do color. They're more for black and white. So you're going to find a lot more rods in animals that are nocturnal, where there's not a lot of color, and that's not really an important thing to pick up. You're just more concerned with gathering light, whereas cones are very important for birds. Oops, why is that not showing? And so. At the left is a cone cell, which I believe is more similar to what is the cone cells you would find in human eyes or mammalian eyes. To the right is a cone cell for a bird. You can see that oil drop there. This is really important for birds that are using it for distances. I think things like terns, albatrosses, maybe some birds of prey. That oil drop really helps with that. So which I found was interesting. And again, I don't want to get too much into eye anatomy, but I want to make sure we have basis. Light is reflected. It's picked up by our eyes. Cones are the ones that are going to do a lot of that, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And of course, it's really easy on this one to establish where we are. So we're going to be in the animal kingdom, and birds are chordates. That means they have a backbone that protects their spinal cord. And of course, aves, which will be birds. When we talk about all of them, there's a lot of diversity in birds. They're fantastic. There's like over 10,000 species in the world. Again, I think birds are true joy. I'm one of those people that likes to grab my binoculars and run out when somebody says, "Ooh, there's a blah 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 out there." So, what we're going to do is really discuss, the coloration of birds and how important it is. What makes a bird a bird? If you're looking at an animal and it has feathers, you've got a bird. It's all about feathers. And this is something I think, that you don't have to have a big degree in. This is something that everybody can relate to. And I think it's pretty obvious that there are so many different structures and so many different colors and feathers. But where do those colors come from, and how are they important and how do they function? So that's what I want to talk about. Right after we talk about more about feather. And CME, I'm going to define feather for you tonight. A keratinous outgrowth of the skin of birds is highly modified for the purposes of flight, insulation, and display. The emphasis on display is mine because that's a lot of what we're going to be talking. We're going to ignore the whole flight and insulation pieces of that. We're going to stick with display and the importance of those colors. There's my side note. After we take a second here to talk about the avian eye, and specifically, as a reminder, this is what's picking it up. Birds have great eyesight. Eyesight's important for a bird because they fly, and it's no good not having, being able to fly if you can't see where you're going or see what you need to avoid when you're flying. So birds tend to have fantastic eyesight. There's a lot of mammals that don't have good eyesight, reptiles and amphibians that may have not great eyesight, and that typically is a reflection of their habits and behaviors, or even their habitat and where they live. Birds tend to have great eyesight, even the birds that come out at night. They have a different number of cones or rods depending on their lifestyles, but they need to have good eyesight. And so because of that, color becomes a very important facet of their outer appearance, because color is now something that they can use to communicate. Obviously, certain other behaviors as well, but color becomes very important because now, because you know that the other birds are going to see good as well, and so having using color as a communication device is very, very important. So there's that avian cone again. Now, rods versus cones. Rods are more sensitive to light, as I mentioned earlier, but cones enable color vision. So you tend to find a higher number of cones in diurnal birds. 80% of all the receptors may be cones, as opposed to, something like an owl, maybe a nighthawk. Some of these birds that come out at night, where the majority of the receptors in their eyes are probably going to be rods, and that's to increase the amount of light that they can take in. So it's really important. And it gets even further. Sometimes on the structure here, some birds have a second fovea. Fovea tends to be where a lot of the receptors are packed in and focused on, and that's one of the clearest points in your field of vision. And many birds, I think like hummingbirds, kingfishers, birds of prey, several of them have a second fovea. So again, your eyes are really important. You can look at it as taken advantage of, or look at it as something that has developed as a result of, but birds have great eyesight, and because of that, they have some pretty spectacular colors, and those colors are really, really important in communication. So where do those wonderful colors come from? This is what we really want to talk about here. You've got pigments and you've got structure. One or the other, or maybe a combination of the two, is going to be what produces the color that you see in the bird that you're looking at. So let's start with pigments. And a pigment is a compound that produces color in the tissues of living organisms. Note the U in color, because I got this from a British book. The biological function of the compound may or may not be directly associated with this property. So if you think about pigments, a pigment with a property, with a function that's really important, is something like hemoglobin, which carries oxygen in our blood. Another pigment would be something like chlorophyll, which obviously is instrumental in photosynthesis in plants. And when plants turn colors, it's because when they cut off supplies to the leaves, chlorophyll is the first one to disappear, and when chlorophyll disappears, you see the other colors that were being masked. One of those colors is carotenoids, which we'll talk about in a moment. So an example of how pigmented color works in a bird is you got the light hitting the surface of the bird. All the other wavelengths are absorbed except, say, red. This is a northern cardinal, and so because all but the red wavelengths of light are absorbed, the red is reflected in all directions. So that's what you see when you look at this bird. And obviously, there's other colors. There's lots of display detail, so it's not just the red, but that is how pigmented color works in birds. It's fairly simple. When feathers grow, feathers grow just like hair. Once a feather starts growing, this piece of the feather, I think you guys can see my cursor. The piece of the feather you're looking at, they are not alive. Just like hair, once hair starts growing, you can trim it and do whatever you want to it because it's not alive. Obviously, if you pull it, it hurts, but that's because it's still anchored into your skin. And the same would be, feathers. If you pluck a feather out, I'm sure that bird is definitely not going to be happy. So what happens is once the feathers start growing, whatever color or whatever pattern you want in your feathers, or you're expecting your feathers, needs to be in that feather already as it grows. Because as the feather grows, you can see it begins to curl out. So you got a little bit of feather here, number 4, and more in number 5, and obviously 6. You got a mature feather, and that sheath is gone. So here are, if I remember correctly, I think this is quail. Here's an early feather growth, and you can already see the beginnings of that pattern that's going to be on the fully grown feather here at the bottom. But those colors already have to be in there. You can't change that feather again, just like hair. It's dead once it comes out, and so it's important that those colors are in there as the feather grows already. And so a lot of these are pigments. The yellow is probably carotenoids, and the black is melanin. Black and the grays and the browns. We'll talk about that a little bit more. And so you can also change the color of those feathers. Just because a bright yellow, on the right here with our goldfinch, a bright yellow feather grew out at the beginning of spring, that doesn't mean in the fall you can't have a more drab or less bright yellow feather draw out. And so it's also a way of saving resources. You know, it can be very resource intensive to grow feathers that are very bright, very pretty. You know, you're going to put a lot of pigments in those, and so you can save some effort and you can save some energy by producing less drab colors. And so for birds like this goldfinch, which do molt twice a year and replace their feathers, those same areas that the feathers came out bright yellow are going to come out drab, and vice versa. In the spring, you'll be able to produce again those bright yellow feathers as well. And this is just, you know, I wrote winter versus summer plumage, or is it summer versus winter? This is a slide from another program where I talk about how, you know, in some books you'll see winter and summer plumage, and that's very central to how we perceive it here with our timeline in the northern hemisphere, whereas other birds, it's probably more accurate to talk about their breeding and non-breeding plumage, non-breeding being winter and breeding being summer. Excuse me. For birds that migrate, because you know, the birds tend to spend summer and summer year round, and so it's more appropriate to talk about breeding and non-breeding plumage. But here, with a bird that sticks around the majority of the year, you can get away with winter and summer plumage if you want. So two common pigment groups. These are not the only pigment groups, but these are the two that I'm going to talk about are carotenoids, which is red to yellow, it includes orange in between, you know, that whole shift of colors, and melanin, black, gray, brown, and buff. And they can combine as well to make some interesting colors. But let's start with the carotenoids. If you're into organic chemistry, there's a nice design. There's a nice, what you call it? Oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the words. Apologies. There's a nice outline of what the carotenoid molecule looks like, or one of them looks like. Carotenoids are not produced in the bird's bodies, and this is really important. They must be consumed through their diet, and then their body's going to process those carotenoids to then produce the pigments that they want to then grow in their feathers. So before they can grow feathers that have these pigments in their body, they have to first consume them, and this is often done through, you know, consuming berries and other plant materials. They are essential to the immune system. You know, so it's thought that there's a link between appearance and fitness. If you have a bird that's very brightly colored, and it's obviously brightly colored through carotenoids, then it's very healthy. I'm going to talk about this, I think, a couple of times, where appearance of the bird can be an indicator of health, which for us is like, oh, hey, that bird's healthy, but for a potential mate can be very significant when you're displaying your colors and the structures of your feathers. Okay, so something like a house finch. You know, is there a link between appearance and fitness? There's a really good discussion in one of the books I'll show you later about how it's thought that this is very important, and this is one of the theories, but there is yet to be a study that really shows a very obvious link between the fitness of the bird and its appearance with these pigments. So obviously, the more carotenoids that they consume, and they can produce this red color. You'll also see a range of, with the house finch, you'll see a range. Sometimes you'll see very yellow house finch. I've never seen this. I don't know if that's maybe something that's more in their home range, but a very yellow house finch where all this red, where it looks like it's been dipped in a berry juice, is actually yellow. And that could be how the body's producing, or it could be, you know, a problem with the process of producing the carotenoid pigments. But, you know, a drabber colored male or a not as brightly colored male could be considered less fit. And again, this is a theory. They haven't been able to show it yet in research, but it's strongly supported by a lot of ideas and evidence. Carotenoids will produce this yellow pigment you see here in the shaft of the northern flicker. This is from an eastern bird. Here in the East Coast, we have yellow shafted northern flickers, so they have the yellow shaft to their feather. If you were to go out west, you would find that the flickers out there have a salmon. They're called red shafted, but it's a very salmony color. You can look at the tail and see that salmon coloring right there, which is just, it's absolutely gorgeous. It's one of my favorite things when we moved out there, seeing the flickers like that for the couple of years we were in Colorado. And this really comes down to a difference in processing the carotenoids. I don't know if they're even eating the different carotenoids, but there is definitely a difference in the processing, and that might have something to do with the genetics of the two different populations. So again, you go out west, you're going to see some slightly different looking flickers. Everything else is pretty much the same as far as field markings and coloration, but that the shafts of their feathers are definitely salmon versus yellow, which is really neat. This is a cedar waxwing. And to the right is Morrow's honeysuckle, which is a non-native honeysuckle that was introduced into North America from Asia. And what happens is, if you find, if cedar waxwings feed off the berries, there's a unique carotenoid molecule in this honeysuckle, and it will actually affect the coloration of the cedar waxwing. So if this cedar waxwing tends to feed a lot on this type of honeysuckle instead of some more native berries, excuse me, what you'll end up with, if you look at the tip of the tail here, in the picture that just came up, you can see it's orange instead of yellow. So on the left here is the typical and the typical coloration you would find for a cedar waxwing, and on the right, that orange coloration is not typical. And so this is a bird that has spent some time feeding on that honeysuckle, and when they molt and the new tail feathers come in, you end up with these orange. They end up with these orange tips instead of the yellow tips. So there is a direct correlation between the carotenoids they're eating and how their body processes them, and then puts those pigments into the feathers that they're going to grow. So I thought that was really neat. They haven't found anything. And when I say neat, I'm not being flip. Like, they haven't found a, what you call it? They haven't found a negative connection or a negative result of this coloration. It's simply different. It doesn't seem to affect their fitness or ability to attract a mate or any social standing. It's just a slightly different color. And if they go back and they don't eat that honeysuckle before the next molt, then but they eat the more common or local berries, they'll go back to that yellow coloration. Let's talk about the melanin for a minute. It's going to produce the blacks, the grays, the browns, the buff colors. Melanin is produced internally. There's a image of melanin here on the right, internally by melanocytes, and so it is produced in the body. You don't have to consume something in order to get it into your body. When we talk about getting out and getting some UV, producing your vitamin A. Our body also produces melanin as a result of UV exposure. I didn't see anything for birds, but that would also be tougher if they're, depend on that for their skin, because obviously they're covered with feathers, and those tend to protect their feathers from sunlight and other external issues. Melanin, what's neat is, as I mentioned before, in the definition of the pigment, it also talked about the properties of a pigment, which could be slightly different or separate from that. Melanin adds strength to material. So if you have melanin in feathers, it's going to make them stronger. Melanin in any kind of structure. You will see some eggs that have dark brown streaks. That's melanin. That adds to the strength of the egg and makes them stronger and more resistant to cracking or breaking. And so that's really important. And then melanin can also help the feathers resist bacteria. Oh, question? Oh, someone unmuted there for a second, sorry. And then melanin can also help feathers resist bacteria. Melanin generally resists bacteria, so having it in your feathers can reduce bacterial infection. And we'll mention a couple of birds that's really important for. So here's some snow geese out in Delmarva. If you look, white birds are really pretty, but you'll notice, and hopefully you can see in this image here as they're flying away, there's lots. There's a bird right here. If you can see my cursor, nice. You can see the wingtips all dark. Those are those feathers at the tips of the wings. Those primaries get beat up. They're at the end of the bird's wings. They get beat up a lot, and so having darker wingtips with more melanin makes them structurally more sound and gives the birds a chance to gives the birds a chance to have feathers that are more resistant to breaking and splitting and needing to be grown out quicker. And so having melanin in those wingtips really can be a benefit. Here's a ring-billed gull on the left, and I believe that's a Caspian tern. Hope I'm getting that right. On the right, you can see their wingtips dark as well. You know, again, more melanin in the wingtips to help those primaries withstand the beating they take from a lot of flying, especially terns. Terns do a lot of flying, a lot more, I think, than gulls in some ways. And so you can see that that's definitely a benefit to have stronger wingtips to resist wear and tear. Let's talk about resisting bacteria. Hopefully, I think everybody can look at two animals that spend a lot of time sticking their heads in and around dead things. And obviously, have the ability to get that on their feathers. Having dark feathers with a lot of melanin are going to be more resistant to bacteria. Certainly, they have those adaptations. They have the bare heads. You don't have a lot of feathers on the head, so when you're sticking your head, and be a little gross here for a minute, when you're sticking your head inside the carcass of a dead animal to pull out the bits that you want to eat, whatever those soft bits might be, having no feathers on your head and neck reduces the amount of surface area that bacteria can cling to, and so that's going to help you be a little bit healthier with your choice of food. Then on top of that, having dark feathers that have melanin and are more resistant to bacteria is going to help keep you safe, because again, the lifestyle of these two birds is very much about finding and eating dead things, and so it's no surprise. I think it shouldn't be any surprise to see them that they're very darkly colored, understanding that melanin has that property. These are images of song sparrows from the Sibley Guide to Birds, the second edition. What I want you to note is the bird in the middle here and the bird to the left. These are adult Pacific Northwest. So this is what your song sparrows are more likely to look like in the Pacific Northwest than in the Southwest. The bird on the right is an adult from the Southwest. What's the difference between the Southwest and the Northwest? A whole lot of precipitation. You have a much especially in some of the rainforest areas up in the Pacific Northwest, you can have a completely different type of atmosphere. You can have a lot more wet. You can have a lot more humidity. It's going to be a lot different from the Southwest, which is drier and arid. And so you have a song sparrow with much darker color because that melanin in those feathers is going to be more resistant to bacteria. And this is a selection process. Bird colors are very highly selected for, certainly through sexual selection of mates. But something like this where the birds on the left are in a humid environment where it's more likely that they can get bacteria on their feathers and have problems with their feathers because of that. Have darker feathers with more melanin to resist that can be a big advantage. And you certainly don't need as much melanin in your feathers if you're in the Southwest, especially also if you're in all that light. Having lighter colors is going to be a big benefit as well, so you don't overheat. So two very different color schemes for essentially the same bird. I just had a thought in my head about the humidity, and now I can't complete it. But again, so that melanin is really important. So I'm sorry. So this is another way that selection can drive the coloring of a bird, because the birds that have more melanin are going to be more resistant to bacteria, have less trouble with that, and be more survive more, have better fitness, and be able to mate more. And so it's going to, in these populations here, in that atmosphere, or in that ecosystem, in those humid conditions, it's going to push the birds to be darker. Selection is going to push the birds to be darker because of that. Just like in the Southwest, where it's not humid and it's very bright, and having lighter colors can be important for shedding heat, and also you don't need that much melanin because you're not going to have as much exposure to bacteria. Selection is going to push that population to a very lighter and different coloration. And you can have problems with your melanin sometimes. This is an American robin that was here 2 years ago in the summer. Last time we did camp, which is 2019. I got to show this to some of our campers, and then they went home, and I grabbed my camera and went booking back up the hill and was lucky enough to find it. And you can see the darker feathers here on the robin. The breast has still got a lot of orange on it, but these darker feathers where you'd see the real darker colors, it's very, very light. Almost white. That red is the eye shine from the flash on my camera. I'm not going to go so far as to say that bird had red eyes. I don't believe it had pink eyes, or that it was a true albino. But it was there was partial albinism there. And this is something you'll see. And this can be a sign that the bird is sick. has an infection. This could be a problem with producing melanin inside of its body. This could be something that happens, but it will be, the bird will get better, or it'll be corrected, and the next time the bird molts, it'll have the regular colors. The problem is when it doesn't have the melanin in those feathers, and so the feathers are going to be more brittle. Also, again, less resistant to bacteria. So those are two things that's not going to help that bird right now. And so true albinos in nature often don't live very long because they just don't have that. Remember, birds spend, I can't remember, I think it's like 9 or 10% of their day just preening and taking care of their feathers, taking care of essentially the structures that cover their body that, again, insulate them, allow flight, and have the colors that they need in order to communicate with other members of their species or other organisms in general. And so they spend a lot of time taking care of that, and having the condition like this is not going to be good for that robin. So you have no idea if it survived or saw it for a week or so. It also makes it a lot easier to spot in dark woods. This was a pretty sunny day, but we have a lot of shade here where the bird was, and it kind of stood out from the other robins with that lack of pigmentation. So talking about pigments, on the left you've got a goldfinch, American goldfinch. Lots and lots of yellow, lots and lots of carotenoids, but you can see there's also some good amount of melanin on that wing and that forehead patch there. And on the right, lots of melanin. That is a house wren, definitely much drab color. So if you look at their feathers, okay, here on the right, here's the house wren. It's drab. You got lots of melanin, lots of different shades. It's really about being drab. It's about being inconspicuous, being able to hide in the underbrush. Okay, that male goldfinch, on the other hand, over here on the left, very bright yellow. And what you can see from these feathers is the tip are yellow, but down here you got a lot of white. What that white underlayer is doing is that white underlayer is actually reflecting the yellow. So the light's coming through. Some of the yellow is getting reflected off the feathers because that's the wavelengths that's being reflected. But it might be still going in towards the body. Some of it's going out, but this white here is going to help reflect the rest of that yellow and make sure that yellow gets back out. And you will see a bird that almost seems to glow, that just seems so bright, and no matter what the conditions, and that is because of that white underlayer here. It's going to help reflect that yellow and get it back out in your face and make that bird very, very brilliant and bright and pretty. And so this is something you'll see on many birds that helps to make that plumage really stand out. So let's talk about the structure. Structural color relies on the interaction of light waves with the microscopic structure of the feather, so only certain wavelengths are reflected. So this is another way to get color in birds. By the way, if you're looking at this and you're thinking blue jay, so was I. We were both incorrect. This is actually a mourning dove feather, and it's really interesting because I picked that feather up and I'm like, yeah, blue jay, look at that, pretty neat. It looked blue, everything about it looked blue. And then posted on iNaturalist, and I was schooled as to what that actually was. And I found another tool that I'll share with you a little later too. That I looked it up to double check it, and they were right. And I was really dumbfounded because I really thought that was a blue jay. The classic example of structure informing the color is for hummingbirds. I'm going to do my best here to stumble through this. It's really complicated. In fact, there's a nice description in one of Sibley's books, and at the very end, even he writes, "This is a simplified explanation of some of the basic principles involved. The reality is more complex." But what you've got is you've got layers. Okay. Oops. Whoops, please ignore the text on the left because that is not correct at all. So you've got these layers and the sun's coming in, and these layers have, there's layers upon layers of microdiscs, small discs with air pockets and bubbles, okay? And they're reflecting certain images. So what you're seeing here when you look at this hummingbird, you're seeing the blue and you're seeing the green, that's being reflected, and it's very directional. Okay, and the gorget, the throat pouch of the hummingbird is even more directional because the way those layers in that throat pouch are aligned is you only see that color if it is very much in front of you. So if the bird turns its head, it looks dark, it looks black. And you'll see this with like, we only have ruby-throated hummingbirds. Occasionally we have, an individual of one or two other species that show up. But generally, if somebody asks you what kind of hummingbirds you can see around here, we have ruby-throated. And this is really easy to see. If you've got a hummingbird feeder, pay attention to that bird. And when it's coming in from, the right or left side as you're watching the feeder, you're not going to get a whole lot of that red unless it comes towards you before it gets to that point. But when it's feeding and it's perpendicular to you at a 90-degree angle, you're not going to see that red at all. And you can see more of the green. There's a little more movement in there. And again, it's still very directional, but you're going to see that color. Here is a rufous hummingbird. And this is the gorget is facing you straight out. And so you can see that really bright coloration there. And that is because it's facing you. That bird had turned its head or was, sitting and looking to the left or right. You're not going to see that coloration. You can still see the throat patch. You just don't see the brightness of that color. It's very much angled and it's all straight ahead. Again, when you look at the rest of the hummingbird's body, there's not as much of the rest of it is not, these layers are not stacked and focused as I don't want to say purposely because they're not true. They're not stacked and focused to just reach one spot because the rest of this is not necessarily as much communication as that gorget on the male. And so you'll see these bright shiny colors. You'll see the scattering of the colors through the layers of small discs and bubbles and spaces. But when you come to that throat, it's very much full forward, and that is a communication device between the males, and it's all about territory. In addition to trying to attract a female, they will guard patches of flowers or hummingbird feeders. Rufous are notorious out west for being really snitty with every other hummingbird, especially when they've got a feeder, which I think makes them kind of amusing. But if you want to get other hummingbirds to your feeders, that can make that very difficult. And you'll find iridescence in other birds, not as pronounced. It's a common grackle on the left. In the middle is a European starling. If you get a European starling in the light, I find them frustrating because they are non-native. They can't outcompete our native cavity nesters, and that can be a problem. But if you get a European starling in really good sunlight and get a really good look, you'll see the greens and the purples and the blues. You'll see the starry markings on it. It's absolutely a gorgeous bird, and I understand why it was brought over and introduced. It's very troublesome now. And then this is a frigate bird. This is from the Galapagos. It's obviously a little out of our area here, but there were two frigate birds when I went there. I went there a long time ago. I had the opportunity to go in college, and I remember a professor telling us the difference between the two frigate birds. One was great and one was magnificent, and the great was green, had green feathers around its neck, and it gobbled. It sounded like gobbling, and so I've always remembered that. I can't remember what the magnificent was. I think maybe it was purple around the neck, and what sound it made. But that green, iridescence along the neck, which is certainly part of the display, and it helps us for us. But there's probably colors, even with these birds here, that we're simply not seeing, and I'll come back to that as well. And then, of course, you got something like this. This is definitely not from around here, but this is one way to really maximize your iridescence. I just think this display is fabulous. If you have a second to look this up on YouTube, I think BBC Earth has it, and just see this display of this bird. It's absolutely fantastic. So there's no blue pigment in birds. Blue is produced by the structure of birds' feathers. Okay, and so there's no pigments. This is the way the feathers are structured. We got an eastern bluebird on the left, and a blue jay, blue grosbeak, and an indigo bunting on the right. Okay, so blue light is reflected. Now we can read the term here. I apparently did a cut and paste and forgot to go back there. Blue light is reflected in all directions. It's not absorbed. Everything else is absorbed. But you got this spongy layer here with tiny air pockets and channels. On the hummingbird, you've got these widths of structure in the feathers, and so like think of a green hummingbird. When all that light's coming through, the width on those feathers is on those little layers and structures is the length of green that you're going to see, and so the green hits that and gets reflected back, and in whatever angle it is, but it's reflected and it is really maximize. So it's almost like selected for and back, so you see a lot of green. The other colors that come in might get reflected, but they're the different length. They're not the same width as that material. The wavelength is longer, and the material is not the same width as that wavelength. And so they tend to go in different directions, and they cancel each other out. And that's why you don't see those other colors. What's going on there? A similar thing happens here with this spongy layer here, where you've got this keratin and air matrix, as it says. And the blue will be moved around and enhanced and reflected out, where these other colors will be absorbed. They'll get reflected at different wavelengths or cut short, and they cancel each other out, excuse me. And so you're going to see all this blue, and obviously you can still see these dark patches on this, excuse me, indigo bunting, which is from melanin. But at you're really getting this blue, and this is really from the structure of the feathers and that spongy layer that has tiny air pockets, and that's maximizing the blue as it comes out. Oops. And then, so I mentioned there's no blue pigment. There's no green pigment either, and you'll see some greens, like this is a black-throated green warbler. Warblers of Vireo's flycatchers have some green colors that we'll see. What you're actually seeing is a combination of the yellow and gray feathers. And they produce colors that we would consider greenish. If you really look around the head here, I chose this picture specifically for that. You can almost, I feel like it gives that greenish, a greenish appearance, not obviously a really bright green like this, whatever plant this was in the foreground. But you can also see the yellow, and you can see the gray, and so you can see that there's a mixture of these different feather colors in there, and they're combining to give this greenish hue for this bird. So that's something you'll see in the warblers. Red-eyed vireos, I think, have a very greenish look to them. Some of the flycatchers do as well. I mean, the flycatchers all look the same, and some of the warblers have that coloration as well. There are now another way to do green is to mix blue and yellow, which we all know. Birds do this by having a yellow pigment and a blue structure, and that produces green, and you'll see that in some of the parrots. I don't remember which parrots these are. I think these are one of the parakeets. They were preening each other, which was adorable. But you can put those together, so you're going to still get a green color that way. Deeper blacks can be a result of a healthier feather structure too, not melanin, but a healthier structure. So you've got these deep blacks in the bird, and other birds are like, oh hey, he's got some really nice feather structure there. I think he would make a good mate, so we could have some young with really great feather structure. They don't see it that way, but what they do see is a measure of fitness. And so really striking colors are really good. Blanking on the word again. Contrast between the bright colors and the darks is really going to give that bird an appearance of good fitness, which means it's able to find the things it needs, and that's going to be a good gene pool to have your young come from. This is an American redstart on the top and a black-throated blue on the bottom. So, and one question that always comes up with birds is sexual dimorphism. And you see sexual dimorphism between different species a lot. This is a mallard, the male's on the left, the bright coloration, females on the right. And again, she's not drab. If you look at those feathers, there's a lot of detail in there. There's a lot of, melanin. There's a lot of pattern that's being developed by that melanin. It's really, really beautiful. Something else to look at is some of the quail. They have these patterns from the melanin in their feathers. It's just absolutely stunning and really worth paying attention to. And so even though it's just an all brown bird, and you've got this bright green head and bright yellow bill, and that really seems to draw your attention, that's probably part of it. It's very not easy to spot this female. If she's sitting on all this material here to the left, she's going to be harder to spot, and that's very much about taking care of the young. You're sitting on a nest. You don't want to be spotted to get eaten. You don't want to be spotted and take off and your eggs or your young get eaten. And so that coloration helps. For the male, this coloration is about attracting a female. It shows off his fitness in finding food, and so it's brighter as well. If you think about something like a cardinal, where the female is much I hate the word drab. I'm trying to avoid drab. Not as brightly colored as the male. The male's that bright red, and it really stands out. And obviously, he's saddled with that for the whole year, because even when he molts, there's the males don't really seem to have a non-breeding plumage, and so he's bright red year round. So when he's not looking for a female, he's spending a lot of time trying not to get eaten as a bright red bird in the forest. Obviously, it works for him. He's small, so that certainly helps as well. You're not this large bird that's flying around with this bright color. But it's definitely the difference in the two colorations. Something that's really interesting about sexual dimorphism is it's strongly linked to migration. 75% of migratory species are sexually dimorphic. 75% of sedentary species are not. Obviously there's exceptions. I just mentioned the cardinal and the mallard, which are both more sedentary species. Don't see them really migrate as much. But something like, and again, the robins, which were, I think when I was a kid, they were considered more migratory. Although you don't really see that as much because there's so much ornamental stuff. There's so many opportunities for food in these urban areas that they don't move nearly as much as they used to. We still get a movement of some of the more northern birds that are down here for the winter and then head back up in the spring, but I think a lot of our robins don't really go anywhere. There is some sexual dimorphism between robins. On the left is a male, and on the right is a female. And hopefully maybe you can see a little bit of the coloration there. One of the things that I learned a few years ago from birding that you never really considered is males tend to have more of a helmet. What that means is they got a much darker head, and there's a distinct line between the dark plumage on the head and the rest of their body, which is not as dark. And so this is more typical of a male, where you've got that dark helmet as opposed to the female, which does not have that. And I'm pretty sure this one on the right's a female. Could be a young one, but definitely isn't developing a helmet. But again, as I showed you the mallard, where it's much more pronounced. Look at another bird where it's definitely more pronounced. This is the indigo bunting, beautiful, bright blue species. They spend a lot of time calling from trees. When they're, in the right time, they have a really nice, beautiful call that's worth learning. And these are the females on the right. Look like two different birds. This is really classic sexual dimorphism. The thought behind the link between sexual dimorphism and this coloration and the birds migrating is that the males are coming back first. So the males come back first. They have established territories. They establish territories. They start calling. They're brightly colored. So these are both ways of advertising their territory. The females come later to essentially cruise for the males that have the territories and see who's out there and who's prettiest. So these two, and then the females, because they're not with the males, they spend less time maintaining a territory. Because they spend less time maintaining a territory, they have less of that coloration because they don't need to. That's not part of what their duties and what they do. So they're going to spend more time nest building. They're spend more time on the nest, getting food for the young, or sitting there and protecting the nest and young. And so they have a much less colorful aspect to them. This is then reinforced by selection. The earlier the males, the brighter they are, the more likely they are to find a female. Because again, the females are not maintaining a territory, so there's less selection for them about that, maintaining that territory and having those colors. And so having a much more bland or drab, I guess, brown coloration makes them more successful at raising young. And so that selection pressure then on on the females pushes them to be this more brownish color. And so what you see is in the species two very, very different looking, in shape very similar, but in coloration very different looking birds. And that's the link and the thought process between that. I don't know if this means that cardinals used to be migratory or mallards were more migratory. But I thought that was really, really interesting that to see how they're, the view of the coloration and selection and pushing the two genders to be a very different coloration. And again, this is what we can see. If you look at bird vision here down at the bottom, their vision extends into ultraviolet. It's very likely that some of the pigments and some of these feather structures, we can't even see the ultraviolet colors that they're providing as well. So if birds can see in ultraviolet, there's probably a good chance that some of the cues they're receiving from each other are ultraviolet as well. And so what we can see and what we can't see are obviously two very different things. And it's likely that some of the birds that we don't think are sexually dimorphic could actually be, and it's just ultraviolet cues that we're missing in their plumage. So we talked about obviously the role of colors in mating, choosing a mate, showing the fitness of the bird. And hopefully, I think we're all comfortable with the idea of camouflage by now, so I didn't want to overdo that. But I did want to mention something that was really neat, and this is something I learned just recently. And I don't have a picture of it here, but this was a mockingbird I spotted somewhere in the past year, because this is at a park where I frequented with my daughter during the pandemic here, where we could go and park and spend a little afternoon time when she was supposed to be doing independent study. But if you look at a mockingbird, when they fly, they have those bright white patches on their wings, which really stand out, which could be, helpful in distracting or startling a predator. What's really interesting is one other way they use that is they will stand there, and I mention this because I saw this bird do it and I had no idea what it was doing, but they will stand there, in an area like this, or in, lightly grassed area, and they just pop their wings up in the air, and those white patches are really bright. And what they're trying to do essentially is get the insects that they eat to blink, to startle, to flinch, to just a tiny movement, and they can zone in on that movement and go grab something to eat. So they're using that color to startle potential prey, which is, again, really neat. I had no idea that they did that. And so I was watching this mockingbird, and it did it several times, and it stood there and didn't do anything, and then it moved a couple of feet, did the wing pop again, and apparently had some very good insects that were really good at playing the flinching game and weren't flinching at all. But eventually, I think it may have found something. But that's what they're doing, which is really interesting. Before I completely end here, I think it's important to mention a couple of really good references that I use here. The bird guide on the left is my bird guide of choice when I'm out. I have the app now on my phone, so I rarely carry the book. This is the big book for the whole North America. I've got the smaller book that's just Eastern North America, which I still sit in the car with me, but I use my phone a lot now because it also has sounds. In the center is his guide to bird life and behavior, which is fantastic. He talks generally about birds and goes through the different families in North America. I feel like if you're really into birds, or really questions, or if this got you interested in anything else, it's really worth at least a pickup from the library, if not a pickup off a new or used bookshelf. And this is one of his new books, which I think just came out last spring, What It's Like to Be a Bird, which is similar to this, but this is very much about stoking your interest. So they have, he has these sections where you can just browse, and if something catches your eye, you read it, and then he links you to another part later in the book in one of the families. So it's really good, and his art is fantastic. It's why I like his book. So really good stuff. In addition, allaboutbirds.org is a fantastic website for learning about birds, helping with identification, things like that. They have this thing called Bird Academy, which is several illustrations I used was from there. And then this was the bird watching daily, which has some interesting stuff written by different people, and some of David Sibley's art. The Fish and Wildlife Service has a feather atlas, which if you find a feather, this is what I mentioned, when someone was like, that's a mourning dove, not a blue jay. I was like, mourning dove, whatever. And I went and looked at the feather atlas, and I was like, oh, wow, it really is a mourning dove. Huh. So it's a really good reference. And, if you find a feather, it's hard. I mean, there's a lot of feather stuff in there, and it's not, but they have an ID tool, which is what I linked to here. Which I recommend using to start, because otherwise it's just like looking through feathers. If you don't have a good idea, or even a close idea where you're starting, it can be frustrating really quick. And of course, iNaturalist, you can put feathers up. There's a lot of people ID feathers, which again is how I figured out my mourning dove. And then several photos I used was for the National Park Service Gallery. They have a lot of public domain images, and it's fun to look at. But if you need an image for something, it's a good place to get some public domain images as well. So thank you. I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen now and see if I have any questions. I didn't see anything come up in the chat. My phone's sitting next to me, so if anybody has any questions or want to unmute, please feel free to do so. Okay. Oh, good. There are still people here. Got so quiet.
questions.
What's that? Owl's calling outside right now. Does anybody have any questions for me?
I have one question about robins.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen many male robins, but I don't think I apparently have ever seen a female robin, because the only robins I've seen are the one with the bright colored plumage, but not the sort of more muted plumage that the female have.
Well, so the key is that helmet. It's that head. You know, they can both have a very bright chest and you know, a dark back, but it's that delineation between the head and the rest of the body of the coloration. I'm looking to see if I can find my bird book. That's really the key there. I think once you spot that and feel comfortable with it, it'll make more sense. But I guarantee you've seen some female robins out there. The first time someone, that's another one of those things where the first time someone showed me how to tell the difference between a male and female robin, I really thought they were kidding with me. I thought they were putting it on. Yeah, and so, you know what? The page never shows up when I've got the effects on. Take my fancy.
Thanks. I'm seeing a very adorable owl right now.
Yeah, so am I. All right, there we go. So I can show it here. You can see there's, you know, these are adult male typical, and again, that back isn't that is nearly as deep a dark color, but the head is, you know, in the pale adult or just female, the head is very dark. And
I can't see it.
Is it not? I can see it in mine. You know what? I'll maybe I can scan it and send it to you.
You could stop sharing your screen, and that would make you bigger.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. How about that? Does that make more sense? Can you guys see it bigger now? Because I think I have myself in the spotlight.
That's great.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, thank you. I forgot that step. So you can see the dark of the helmet, but the back is a lighter slate gray there, and you got that bright red there. And sometimes I don't see it, or I see a bunch of robins. I don't see any that look male. And sometimes I see them and they all seem to look male. And I'm never entirely sure if that's something that's more during the breeding season in the spring and summer, and you can't really count on in the fall or winter. But that's always been one of my favorite things to kind of show people that and the fact that people always think when a robin is got their head cocked, that they're listening for the worms, but they're actually focusing with one eye on the soil. And if they see the soil move just a little bit, any kind of, or, you know, a plant move, they thrust their beak down in to grab what they, you know, a worm or whatever's underneath there. And that's how they do some of their hunting.
Thank you.
Sure.
Could you show that robin picture again? I spent longer at it. I didn't really catch what was male, different male and female.
Yep.
Okay, now what's the difference now?
See, so in this one you can see that there's a definite darker head than the rest of the back. The head is much darker, whereas on this female it's about the same color, the head and the back.
Oh, okay, that's the difference.
Yeah, that's what you're looking for, is that the head is much darker, and it's called like a helmet, and it's really a darker, what you call it? It's a darker helmet that helps the robin, or it helps you identify the robin. I don't know if the robins can actually see it. I don't know if how important some of that might be or not. You know, we often use these field marks for our personal identification or to tell different genders, but that doesn't mean that the animals actually use it or are aware of it. And sometimes, you know, you can talk with people who you'll have people argue with you about different things, you know, and be like, well, what's the point of that if it doesn't do that? Sometimes some of these structures or colors are sex linked, and there is another trait that is actually what's driving the selection process in, you know, mating and, you know, how they find each other. And so this structure or this color might be something that's linked with that, but it actually has no benefit or detriment to the animal itself.
Thank you.
Sure. So my ducks are down. Those were black-bellied whistling ducks. Took me a second to remember that, but that is, yeah, black-bellied whistling ducks, which was, we're all sitting in the tree there. That was over a river in Costa Rica. Occasionally we get one around here. I think there was one, or there was some in Delaware back in January. And occasionally you see them up here, but they're something that's more common, like in Florida and Texas along the Gulf Coast. Any other questions?
Yeah,
Sure.
It's Jenny here. Hi, Ken.
Hey, Jenny.
I was wondering, when the birds have no coloration in their feathers or limited coloration, like the robin you were showing,
Okay.
does that affect their attractiveness in order to be able to breed?
That is a really good question. My guess is it has to be.
Yeah,
You know,
I would think.
like, obviously, you know, I mentioned that, you know, without the melanin, they don't have the extra strength and the extra bacterial resistance.
Right. Yeah,
But-
so they're selected.
Yeah, but again, they're a diurnal bird, so the other robins have to see that coloration, and because we don't see tons and tons of, you know, we haven't seen a bunch of leucistic or partly albino birds. My assumption is it doesn't help them at all.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it would be just the opposite.
Yeah, that's a good question. I didn't actually come across something to state that specifically, but my assumption would be that. But then again, that's what you know, Sibley was saying in his book. You're welcome. Sibley was saying in his book was, you know, we assume that there's a correlation between the fitness of the bird and the coloration because of how much they eat and then they're, you know, the brighter color, but they haven't been able to prove that through a laboratory setting or field studies.
Yeah. Now, but you said that the it's what they eat is the carrot stuff. It affects the yellow and the red, but it doesn't affect the blue and the yellow. The blue.
Right. Right.
Okay.
So the blue is something that's produced by feather structure. That's not going to come from a pigment.
Right. Okay. So that's not affected by what they eat.
Correct.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure I got that. I understood you correctly when you were talking. Okay. So a fellow Armin member who lived in Alexandria over by Duke Street and the Wild Bird Center down there.
Okay.
She has 2 years in a row gotten a leucistic, completely white robin. So it managed to survive for 2 years. It disappeared after that. If it managed to breed, it wouldn't necessarily have white children.
Correct. Yeah, because you know, think of your Punnett squares from genetics in biology class. You know, that's definitely not going to be a dominant trait. And so if it's successful enough, it's more than likely that its offspring will have enough dominant genes that it's going to mass that over.
Yeah. Okay. So if it molts and loses all its feathers, would its feathers come back white necessarily if it's eaten more healthily?
It depends on why it was.
Yeah, of course. Okay.
It depends on why that happened. Yeah, because they can. One of the things I read is that they can come back and, you know, the next time they molt, they're back to normal colors.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, it just depends on what caused that initially.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And then also, I had read an article, courtesy of one of my students, that said that the cardinal eats the Japanese honeysuckle berries and makes itself much redder, and therefore it gets selected more often for mating because it's a brighter red. It looks healthier. But I'm thinking, in fact, it's probably less healthy because the Japanese honeysuckle does not provide the food that a native berry would provide. So the bird in general is less healthy, even though it looks more healthy.
Yeah, I don't know what the nutrient content of it is, but yes, and that's why they said, you know, they don't have again, coming back to that part, I'm not trying to say it over and over. They haven't been able to see that link between coloration and perceived fitness, if that's true or not. But yeah, it would certainly stand to reason that if they're brighter red, they're going to at least appear that they're more fit and better at finding the food.
Yeah, and yet if they're eating non-native plants, they're probably less healthy because the non-natives have the sugars and ours need to have it as the fat, I think.
So
No,
yeah,
that's not true. I mean, really, we eat lots of things from other countries which are very healthy to us, and it's really not true. The bird, just because it's not native doesn't mean the birds can't do very well. Look at a butterleaf and bush, which the
You
insects
are
love.
absolutely wrong. You
well,
are
hold on. Let me
absolutely
take this
wrong.
one, please, because I'm the presenter. What happens is, if it's non-native, there's a very good chance that our native species aren't able to exploit it for what's there. And so, unfortunately, they're not interchangeable. So while it might help with the coloration, it might not be providing the necessary nutrients or nutrition that you're going to see from something that would be around here. So that's very much a question. I don't think we can definitively say it doesn't or that it does. I think that it's what our experience and from some of the other things that we've seen would be to say is it's unlikely that it's as nutritious as local foods. It's just like it's the difference between poison ivy climbing up a tree and English ivy climbing up a tree, because the trees here have co-evolved and developed in the ecosystem with poison ivy, and so it's less likely to be as harmful to the trees as English ivy, which is not something that the trees have co-evolved with nearly as long, and so you have that relationship there. And to me, that would be the key to investigating that is do the native plants, are they more nutritious than the non-native? And my guess would be that they are. But again,
studies recently showing, and they actually determined that at least the European plants provide sugars to their local birds, and the American plants provide fats to our local birds. And when the American birds eat the European berries, they are getting a lot of sugar, but they aren't getting the fats that they need.
Interesting. So it's funny because again, and it's one of these things where you until you test it out, you can have ideas. I just read an article about why zebras are black and white striped, and it was all about reducing the amount of bites they get from flies. And that is not at all anything I remember reading about zebras. They test all these things out, and they found out that lions and hyenas can't even see the stripes until they get really close, and so it really wouldn't be effective in the way they thought it, being confusing, and it had everything to do with reducing bites from flies, which have a lot of parasites, and zebras who don't have a very thick coat are very susceptible to it.
Yeah, it's not a protection against predation.
Right.
Yeah.
Allison,
I thought that was funny too.
Okay. Allison, one of my favorite birds as far as being colorful isn't actually that colorful, but it's the hooded merganser. I think they're absolutely gorgeous. Painted buntings are just, every color in the book, and I have no fashion sense, so I like them a lot because they're very bright and pretty. But yeah, I think the hooded merganser, just the coloration of it, and the loon, it's very similar. It's just a lot of black and white, but it's really pretty variations in those colors. So yeah, it's a good question. Thank you.
This is Jean. I just wanted to say that from what I've been reading, most of our migratory species started migrating from the Paleoarctic, but cardinals are one that they believe migrated north from the tropics. And that the females then are the ones who changed color. They probably had that bright red coloring like many of the tropical birds, and the females became a little more muted for their camouflage.
Interesting.
Well,
Thank you.
Except a lot of tropical birds do have the females are kind of drab. Camouflage, obviously, and other reasons. So again, you can't say that because you really are. You look at bird of paradise, things like that. The females are much drab, peacock, things like that.
Okay. Any other questions? All right. I'm gonna go feed our owl. So thanks for joining me tonight. I'm gonna clean up a little bit, make sure the animals are all good, and I'm gonna head home. I hope you all have a wonderful night, and I appreciate you joining me.
Thanks, Ken.
Thank you, Ken. Great presentation.
Oh,
Thank you. Very good presentation.
Thank you. You all have a wonderful night. Oh, clapping. That's awesome.
Bye.
recording?